Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. The book is Father Augustus Tolton, the Slave Who Became the First African-American Priest, proudly published by EWTN Publishing. Great to have you on board as part of our authors group, as well as being one of the hosts here on EWTN.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and it's great to be part of the EWTN publishing family.
Right. So how many books have you written now?
4. This is the 4th book.
Okay.
And it was inspired by the fact that, when I first came across Father Augustus, I was in 7th grade, I remember, and this is before internet and computers and all that. I was trying to find a confirmation saint, and I wanted to find one that looked like me. So I was doing my little research in the card catalogs and came across Father Augustus Tolton. I'm like, who is this guy? So that was the first time I've even heard of him. I couldn't use him, of course, because he wasn't a saint. But that was the first time I've heard about him. And he's always stayed with me over the years.
Right. It's interesting. In the introduction, you reference another book that was written earlier by a sister, Caroline Hemasath, where they talk about Father Augustine Tolton's life from slave to priest. And I remember the documentary we had, and it was Augustine Tolton, and that's how I always heard it. Why is it Augustus?
Yeah, both names are used interchangeably. On his birth certificate, it is Augustus Tolton. And now that he's a servant of God on his way to following the canonization process, they used his birth name on the birth certificate, which is Augustus. What happened over time, it just became kind of standardized to Augustine, which is kind of the modern way of saying Augustus is Augustine.
Right.
And so both names are used interchangeably, but we used Augustus because that's the name that's being used in the canonization process.
Right. And so you decided to write this book. You approached EWTN, they approached you. How did that work?
No, EWTN Publishing approached me, and I was thrilled because I was thinking about what my next book would be. And so when they approached me, I immediately said, I have to do something on Father Augustus, especially since the canonization process had been moving forward, and I want more people to know about him and experience him, and I thought, what a wonderful way to do that.
And you talk about the strength you see in his story, which you get because he exercised his priestly ministry under the weighty yoke of racism, obviously. He was a beacon of hope to black Catholics in the 19th century. Why was he Catholic? You talk about his family. You know what really impressed me the most was his mother in a lot of ways.
Yes.
I mean, he had that grit, but that came from her, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because his dad died during the war, right?
Yes, his dad escaped through the Underground Railroad first to help free his family, but he died early on, so when he didn't come back, his mother then escaped with Augustus, his brother and sister, through the Underground Railroad. But they're Catholic because the slave owners baptized him as Catholic. In fact, on his baptismal certificate, it says that he was property of Stephen Elliott. So on the day he was property. So they were Catholics because the slave owners baptized them as Catholic. In fact, his middle name, John, is after the priest that baptized him.
Okay.
So when they escaped the Underground Railroad to Quincy, Illinois, that's when they went to a Catholic church because all they knew was the Catholic faith. Right.
You say he was a tireless messenger of the gospel who was not afraid to go into the deep South where racial hatred had reached a high pitch and where segregation was decreed by harsh laws. But the reality was it was pretty racist throughout the country. I mean, his experiences when he went up to Quincy, it wasn't like they were welcomed necessarily by open arms by everybody.
That's correct. When they started trying to find a Catholic parish to worship, interestingly enough, the priests and the nuns welcomed them. It was the parishioners who had issues. They would say things like, we're going to stop giving money to the parish. We will pull our kids out of Catholic school. We will even leave the Catholic faith if they continue to worship with us. And so they kind of got moved around from church to church until finally a rugged Irish priest, Father Berger, said, I don't care what these people are saying, you're going to stay. And it was there that Augustus began to develop his calling, his vocation.
I thought it was interesting too, because you think about that and the pain he went through. You say the idea that even today in the post-civil rights era, sometimes you were talking about how black Catholics can be affected by liberation theology. I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, in the liberation theology, it talks about freeing ourselves from these social structures. So often they compare themselves to Pharaoh in Egypt and the people leaving the oppressive regime of Pharaoh to find freedom. And so some people think you have to leave the magisterium and the teaching authority of the church, which is like Pharaoh, to find freedom from that. And that's just not true. And that's something that the life of Father Augustus Tolton sheds so beautifully.
Right, exactly. In this version of Catholicism, faith is subordinate to political ideology, and the church becomes an instrumental good rather than an intrinsic good as the necessary means of salvation. Again, that's what you're talking about, like in a social construct. You say, Father Tolton, the former slave who became a Catholic priest, knew well that the basis for any authentic theology of liberation must be the truth about Jesus, the church, and the dignity of man.
Yes, exactly, because Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. And so if you keep your life focused on Jesus Christ and the teachings of Jesus Christ and not the social structures that are around that, because there was a contradiction there. Jesus is teaching this, but the churches, the parishioners are doing, wait a minute here. So if people ask, why did he just leave and go someplace else? Because he knew the fullness of the truth was in Jesus Christ and in the Catholic faith. Right.
In fact, you refer to him that the life of Father Tolton is a study in faithful obedience. And today, that's the kind of thing that stick-to-itiveness is not something that in a lot of cases is prized. It's kind of like, if you're uncomfortable, if you're not feeling good about a situation, you get out of it.
Yes. But authentic freedom is rooted in the obedience of faith, right? Jesus says, I've not come to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So when your will is in communion with God's will, when those two are in communion, then you can be truly free to be the person who God created you to be. And that's one of the great lessons that the life of Father Augustus Tolton teaches us.
Well, here's a great quote. You said that he taught that the Catholic Church deplores a double slavery, that of the mind and that of the body. She endeavors to free us both. She is the church for our people.
Yes. Again, so many people thought, well, why are you staying Catholic when the church is treating you like this? And then he had that great quote that he gave in a talk. And that line probably strikes me more than anything else. Because that's something that we can draw from every day, even in our day when we're experiencing turmoil or trouble in the church. We have to look at the broader picture that what Father Augustus Tolton focused on was the teachings of the faith and not the people who are not always faithful to the church's teaching.
Right, that's where you get into where are we to go, Lord? You have the words of eternal
life.
Amen. Exactly. And whether we like it or not, this is the church that our Lord founded. So,
that's right.
So here we plant our flag. Amidst great persecution, you say, he showed us that being configured to Christ means emptying ourselves so that God can fill us. It means exposing the weakest parts of who we are so that God can make us strong. That's something that people are very reluctant to do today, to kind of expose themselves in that way.
See, and this is where Christ crucified plays an important role. Think about it. Paul says, I preach Christ and Christ crucified. I want to know nothing except the cross of Jesus Christ. Because on the cross, Jesus is vulnerable. But it's in that vulnerability that he calls his greatest strength. And that's what Augustus Tolton knew. Especially, there's a great scene where he finds out that he's going to be ordained a priest, and he gets his assignment. He thinks he's going to the continent of Africa or to Borneo.
Right, Borneo,
and he said he's going back to the United States. And he was troubled because he didn't want to go back to the racism that he didn't experience for so many years when he studied in Rome.
Right, yeah.
But he went into that chapel and he knelt before the crucifix in adoration. And he saw the vulnerability and said, I need to be like Christ. I need to be vulnerable and obedient to the will of God. So if this is your will for me, Lord, I will go and serve.
Right, because also, and you recount the story when he starts off as an altar server, memorized the Latin prayers for Mass. You Father Berger, you were talking about before, who had a sense that he had a vocation, right?
Yes, and Father Berger fostered this. He saw and he nurtured it and began to teach him some philosophy and theology and kind of give him the basics to prepare him for eventually life in the seminary.
Right, but he was rejected by every seminary.
Yes, Father Berger helped him to apply to every seminary in the United States at the time, and each one rejected him because he was black. Even the religious orders wouldn't take him.
Now, the Josephites, I think, at the time who had been founded there, the St. Joseph Society for Foreign Missions, today known as the Josephites, were established in Baltimore, especially to deal with freed blacks who were Catholic, but they didn't have a seminary.
Correct.
Right? That was the issue. Right?
Correct. Because so what the bishop wanted to do was to have Augustus wait until a seminary was established and then send them there. but he was already about 24 years old. So I mean, time is passing here, and he just didn't want to wait. And so, the Franciscans end up writing their superior general in Rome, who went to the cardinal who was in charge of the Congregation Propaganda Fidei, the propagation of the faith, which was the Vatican school that taught priests to be missionaries. Right. And that's what was the inroad that he got in for his training to be a priest.
Right, and when he actually went to Rome, he was welcomed quite well, right?
Yes, it was probably the greatest time of his life, because the racism and the divisiveness was not there. He was just accepted as one of the seminarians, and he actually loved his time in Rome very much.
Right, after being ordained to the priesthood in 1886, Father Augustus Tolton toured England and Europe. You talk about he celebrated his first Mass in the United States for the School Sisters of Notre Dame. To this day, a plaque in the chapel of St. Mary's Hospital in Hoboken, New Jersey, of all places. Aren't you a Jersey boy?
Yes.
I thought so. Reads the first Mass in the United States by the first Afro-American priest is still there.
That's right.
Have you ever seen that plaque?
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact. In fact, the sisters, when he was growing up, taught him, he ended up, of course, knowing Latin because of the prayers, but also knew German fluently and French as well. And it was the sisters that really helped nurture and foster his education, which helped prepare him well for life in the seminary.
Right, and he also, you mentioned his first solemn high Mass, St. Benedict the Moore Church, a black parish in New York City, and then ultimately went to Quincy and actually was assigned to a black parish there.
Yes. And it was wonderful because he welcomed everybody to the parish. See, it was supposed to be the black parish, but he said anybody is welcome here. And that became problematic to the other white pastors, right? Exactly, right. Exactly.
He started attracting other people.
Exactly, and he welcomed everyone. But the problem was some of the white priests would say things to the white parishioners that would go to his Mass that it didn't count for their Sunday obligation if they went there, because that was for the black Catholics, not for the white Catholics.
Right, which is amazingly outrageous. You say, in addition, there were deliberate, systematic, and sustained attempts by Protestant denominations and secret societies to lure blacks away from the Catholic Church. What do you mean, secret societies?
Well, secret in the sense that they weren't public, but they were there to try to lure away. Because they were saying, well, look at this church. You won't let them worship. You have to sit in the back. You have to go to your own church. You don't want to be part of that. You want to be part of this, and because of the poverty and because of they weren't well educated, which is something that Augustus worked diligently to try to educate people on, here is the faith and here's what we believe. Despite all the stuff that's going on around you, we need to stay true to the faith. And so he was a very strong proponent of solid catechesis and Catholic education as a way of bringing people into deeper understanding and relationship with Jesus Christ in the Catholic faith. Right. Instead of being pulled away, because people were being lured away. These societies, oh, we have food, we have clothes, so they were meeting the physical, corporal needs. Now, did these tend
to be exclusively other black churches who were doing this, or were there actually white churches that were trying to pull them away?
Yes, there were both that were doing it.
Okay, because unfortunately you read in here that Bishop James Ryan didn't do the best thing by saying, well, let's not have any problems. Why don't you just minister to blacks?
Well, he didn't want to have a problem with his priests. Right. I mean, what bishop wants to have a problem with their priests? And so he kind of sided with the other priests and said, well, you really don't need to have the black. And see, what happened was, though, the white parishioners were contributing financially to the parish because the black parishioners were really poor and destitute. They didn't have any money. So eventually the church started to, even the sisters came in to the rescue to help him to teach and stuff, but they just couldn't sustain it financially.
Right, and also he ended up in Chicago then, right?
Yes. Things got bad there, and with the racism, all the other things working against him, that there was an opportunity for him to go to Chicago, and so Cardinal Sheehan welcomed him in Chicago, and that's where he ministered until he died.
Right, and then there was a temporary storefront mission called St. Monica Chapel.
Yes, and so there was not a church per se for them. So they started worshiping in the basement of a church, and then Augustus asked the bishop if they could set up their own church in like a storefront, and so they did that while they raised money to build St. Monica. So they ended up building kind of the first floor, and they wanted to build up, but they put a roof on it, kind of capped it, and wait till they get more money, which never happened. Right. Unfortunately, yeah.
Right, I think, in the 40s, I think. That was put. Now, he died fairly young, right? I mean, he died in 97 from heat stroke and uremia.
Yeah, so Father...
A lot of stress, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
it's a lot of stress. He didn't take really care of himself. His mother ended up being his housekeeper.
Yeah, she ended up outliving him. Right?
Yes, living with him in the rectory, was his housekeeper. And he was traveling all over the country giving talks to try to raise money to build St. Monica's. He even contacted Catherine Drexel, who becomes St. Catherine Drexel, and she did contribute money to the cause as well. But all of the work, and he just felt it was all this was on his shoulders, and he felt such responsibility. And he ended up dying of uremia, which is a complication from heat stroke.
Right.
Yeah, 43 years old.
Now the book is, gives an outline to his life, but that's not really what the book's just about, is it?
Right, because there's already a book about his life, from slave to priest. By Sister Carolyn Hemisath, which you mentioned earlier. What I wanted to do in this book was to say, what lessons can we today learn from the life and the legacy of Father Augustus Tolton and bring that into our contemporary experience in the life of the church and in the family today? So I talk about how do we overcome racism, which is an issue of divisiveness in our country today. How do we build strong families amidst all the things in the culture that are pulling families apart? How do we deal with suffering? How do we find solace and peace in God's mercy? And so I cover a number of things that I think Father Augustus' life could really be a beacon of light in the darkness of our culture today.
Right. And you talk about the key to defeating racism in the spirit of Father Tolton is to see our brothers and sisters as God sees us, to look at each other through God's eyes. We need to see the image and likeness of God in each other. Then you go on to point out the word for likeness in Hebrew is the feminine noun, demuth. Demuth. Likeness in this context does not mean physical similarity. Why did you want to point that out?
Yeah, so when we hear that in the Genesis chapter 1, the image and likeness of God, well, what does that really mean? Because we have to see the image and likeness of God in each other. Well, that word for likeness, demuth, is actually a feminine noun in Hebrew, and it means similar. So the analogy that I use is like my son, right, Benjamin. What's the difference between a statue of me and my son? Well, the statue looks more like me, and my son looks like me because he's my son, but my son is much more in my likeness because he shares a similar nature than I do, much more than that statue does. The statue may look more like me, my son is much more in my likeness. And so when we look at someone, we want to see the likeness of God in that other person. So, and that's one of the keys, I think, to defeating racism. And Mother Teresa did this so well, and so did Augustus Tolton. He just looked at someone, and he saw Jesus in that person. And I think that's one of the keys, because racism is learned behavior. When you have little kids playing together, they don't wear what race are you, what color you are. They're just kids playing. All the stuff that comes after that, the mocking and the taunting is learned behavior. So we have to kind of unlearn that and start looking at each other and seeing what God sees when he looks at us.
Right. You also talk about here, in talking about Tolton and overcoming racism, a biblical parable of the Good Samaritan, and you kind of talk about that. And I thought this was a great line. You said, "Who is the person you have written off and left for dead at the roadside of your life?"
Yeah, and what I've done at the end of each of the chapters is like a homily, because in fact these homilies were particularly inspired by the life of Father Augustus Tolton. So what I wanted to do was make a connection between these readings that we hear every week at Mass, inspired by the life of Father Augustus Tolton, and then kind of give a kind of a homily on that. So yeah, so the Good Samaritan, you're right, because how many people do we just don't even pay attention to? We just walk by them, we don't even care that they exist. But these were the people that Jesus noticed. These were the people that just didn't walk by because they were the wrong color, because they were the wrong race, because they didn't speak the right language, because they looked different than me. And I think the life of Father Augustus Tolton teaches us that no, we need to take the time to notice everyone, because that's what Jesus did. Okay.
So were you into situation comedies in 1974 through 79 or something here?
Oh yeah, we're talking about Good Times?
Good Times.
That was a great show. And the reason I start off the chapter about building strong families, because when you look at that show about the Evans family, they grew up in what we think is probably the Cabrini Green projects in Chicago at the time. And they were poor, but they stayed together no matter what happened in that family. The traumas, the challenges, they stayed together until James died. Until the father died. And what a wonderful example. We don't see that now, And so I start off with that and to kind of bring in the focus, because look at Augustine's life. His father died, single mother raising him, and he was still able to achieve great holiness because his mother and the people around him instilled such wonderful values of the faith in his life.
I think it was John Amos was the actor, as I recall, who played the part, who had been the weatherman on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, for people who might remember that. Now, you're a married guy, you talk about family, but you're talking about something called Guys' Night Out. How does that fit in?
Yeah, so I talked about with my son, because with the situation with my dad was not a role model at all, what it means to be a real man or establish any kind of holiness in my life. So, but I didn't want that for my son. So what I do with my son is I go take him on a Guys' Night Out. So we go out, we eat some chicken wings, and and we talk about life. We talk about what's going on in our culture today. We talk about what marriage is. We talk about this transgenderism nonsense. We talk about racism. We talk about the dangers to his faith, like pornography and all these other things. And we have a conversation about it. Why? I want him to feel comfortable talking to his father. I want him to, if he has questions, be able to feel comfortable coming and talking to me. And Augustus did this in the sense that he was a spiritual father to so many families and to so many young boys and girls who did not have father figures in their own homes. And so, that again, in that same spirit, I want to pass that on to my son as well, because if I want him to be the man that God created him to be, I want him to learn from my witness and example. Right. And that's something spiritually that Father Augustus did so well.
You say mothers and fathers should teach their children that they have a duty as members of God's family to all who are in need of assistance, especially the poor. In this way, children play a vital role in teaching all people that they have incomparable dignity. And I think somebody once pointed out that, humility and those kind of things and gratitude, that's where that relationships to other people, sometimes self-esteem cuts that out because I'm worried more about myself.
Exactly. And the lesson I wanted to teach there through the life of Augustus Tolton was humility doesn't mean thinking less of yourself, it means thinking of yourself less. So we just can't say, well, look what Jesus says, feed the hungry, give the thirsty, clothe the naked. We actually have to do the things that Jesus teaches that we have to do. So families should be examples and witnesses of that. Right. They shouldn't just tell their children to feed the poor, they should actually do it. My family, for example, on Friday nights, we go to a parish in Portland, St. Andre Bessette, which is known, right in the Skid Row section, if you will, of Portland, every Friday to help feed the homeless people. Right. So we're living the Beatitudes, we're living the teachings of Christ, and not just paying lip service to it. And the life of Augustus Tolton is a wonderful example of that we can bring into our own family life today.
Because it wasn't just he who suffered, his family suffered obviously as well. And you talk about the strength of his mother in the book. You also say, we as parents may not be as, quote unquote, in the know or as cool as our children think we are. We may not always understand their music and choices of clothes, but they should know this: we would rather die than see them participate in self-destructive behavior.
Yes, exactly. And this is something that Augustus Tolton also did. I mean, by his example, he saw the drinking and he saw the things that the families were involved in, and he wanted to show them the love of Christ in that family. And oftentimes, when we have children, especially when they're teenagers and things like that, and they're that natural separation, independence that happens at that age, they kind of think, oh, God, you guys don't know anything. Like my daughter said to me not too long ago, oh, Daddy, that's so 2000. I'm like, what? Am I that old? It's so 2000. But we can still teach them lessons that will stay in their hearts. Now, they may think that we're crazy in their minds, but we want to plant seeds of faith in the hearts of our children that they will take into their own families one day. So we may think they're not listening to us, but they are listening to us with the ear of their hearts. And that's where we need to plant the seeds of faith so they can grow and blossom when they become older and adults themselves.
Right. You say Father Tolton's legacy encouraged his flock to bear wrongs patiently, yes, but also to see to it that their own houses were in order.
That's right. So Augustus didn't just he helped these families, but he also wanted to create a situation where they can help themselves. He wanted to give them the tools of understanding so that they can go and be better than the situation around them, through the love of Christ and the teachings of the Catholic faith.
Do you have another book in the works?
I have a couple that I'm working on right now.
Thinking about? Okay.
Yep,
So when you write them, you'll come by, right?
absolutely.
Okay, it's always great to see you. Thank you
It's
so much
always
for
an
stopping
honor and
by.
a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The one and only Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. The book is Father Augustus Tolton, and it's published by EWTN. It's The Slave Who Became the First African American Priest. Again, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. Check it out. Join us next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks.